Hey everyone, it is Shaun here with BlackPush. Today we are super excited to be starting our series talking about the different state offices we have here in the state of Georgia and why you need to pay attention to who's on the ballot this year. Today we're talking with two special guests. We're talking to Paul Sonn and we're talking to Sandra Williams. Join us for this conversation about why Labor Secretary in the state of Georgia is so important to you. We have Miss Sandra Williams, who's representing the Retail Wholesale Department Store Union, and she's a board member of one of my favorite organizations, the Atlanta North Georgia Labor Council. And we also have attending with us virtually Mr. Paul Sonn, who's representing NELP today. And we kind of talked about this in the beginning of the segment. Today we want to talk about the position of Labor Commissioner for the state of Georgia. This is a position, as you guys we've talked about before, that doesn't get a lot of recognition, right? And I think that a lot of people just uneducated about the power of the Department of Labor. So starting with you, Sandra, I know we were out doing rallies a lot last year, and we're still out doing rallies.
Absolutely.
On multiple different phases. Explain to people why it's important that they pay attention to the Labor Commissioner's race in the state of Georgia, but everywhere.
Well, first I want to say good afternoon to Paul from NELP Action. They've certainly been a part of our actions here in the state of Georgia. But the reason this particular race and the position of Labor Commissioner is so important in the state of Georgia is because all of us are workers.
Right.
And so during the pandemic, what we found was that there were a number of workers that were displaced, even though we had essential workers that stayed in place. You had hospital workers, grocery store workers, and those folks. The vast majority of people were sent home. We know that the pandemic shut down everything. And so the importance of it is the Labor Commissioner is the person that is basically responsible for ensuring that every workplace is not only safe but paid, adequate wages and that people are taken care of. When that system shuts down, we have unemployment insurance. And the Labor Commissioner is also responsible for ensuring that that is dispersed to people that have work. The employers pay into the insurance and thus they're taken care of when they're not employed. This was an emergent situation across the nation. So we had a number of people here in Georgia that were impacted by this, and I must say we did a very poor job of dispersing funds to keep people going. I'm not talking about COVID funding. I'm talking about actual unemployment insurance that if something happens to your job, you have it to depend on because we all have families and livelihoods. When your livelihood is gone, what happens to your family when you don't have a job? So that's why it's been critically important. We've been side by side with BlackPush. NELP Action has been a part of that in just amplifying the fact that our unemployment offices were closed for 2 years. And many of the people that were supposed to be served through that process, through that system, didn't receive any services at all. As a matter of fact, there are people here now in the state of Georgia that have not received not one unemployment check. Still today, in 2022. The pandemic started, the shutdown was March 2020. So that's almost 2.5 years.
And then that's been absolutely crazy. Actually, last week, so Paul, interesting enough, I was actually on the phone with someone from the Department of Labor, and I thought it was interesting because this person was very transparent about how they felt about the Department of Labor and the current leadership. But they also just was explaining to me the importance of what labor, how it daily impacts our lives. And Paul, I know you have some feedback that you want to give on that too. So from your perspective, why is this race, the Labor Commissioner race, so important to you?
Thanks for having me on today. And Sandra put it well, but Georgia's Labor Commissioner is one of the most important elected offices in the state that most Georgians have never heard of. We really need to change that because the Labor Commissioner has a tremendous impact on Georgians' day-to-day lives, and working people really need to be demanding change from their next Labor Commissioner. And as Sandra explained, the Labor Commissioner determines whether workers will lose their jobs, as more than a million Georgians did during the pandemic will get the unemployment benefits that they need to help pay their bills while they're out of work. The Labor Commissioner is also responsible for cracking down on employers that cheat their workers, for example, by not paying them the wages they're owed or by illegally misclassifying them as independent contractors to try to sidestep labor laws. And he's responsible for protecting farm workers helping workers connect with new jobs also, for example, when they're re-entering the job market after involvement with the criminal justice system or serving in the military. And he's responsible, really for protecting workers all across the state. And the sad reality is that Georgia's Department of Labor has just been doing an appalling job. They've just not been carrying out their basic responsibilities to implement the laws they're charged with and to keep the state's workers safe. They faced really widespread criticism during the pandemic for their ineffectiveness at delivering unemployment benefits. Thousands and thousands of Georgians who worked for years and paid taxes didn't receive the unemployment help they needed during the pandemic, which caused huge hardship. Media investigations and the state audit documented, the closed unemployment offices that Sandra mentioned, but also unanswered phones, long waits for benefits, and especially the kind of high denial rates for workers who are entitled to benefits. And perhaps most troubling, the denial rates for Black workers applying for unemployment were twice the rate of white workers. Really, really deeply disturbing. The other real scandal worth highlighting is, this is the agency charged with protecting farm workers, but actually a federal investigation by the U.S. Attorney's Office of a human trafficking ring involving farm workers has resulted in the indictment of Georgia Department of Labor officials, and it led the top official in charge of protecting farm workers to step down. So, really by every measure, the agency hasn't been doing its job to protect the state's workers.
Let's talk about some of the facts versus myth, right? So one of the biggest myths out there is that everybody seems to think that the labor secretary controls the minimum wage in the state of Georgia. Let's first off eliminate that one. They don't control it, but they can advocate for it.
That's right.
And that's extremely important because they don't control the minimum wage in the state of Georgia. And let's clear that up too, because I think, and Sandra, you talk about this all the time, the minimum wage in the state of Georgia
is $5.15 an hour.
$5.15.
Right. So that applies to your domestic workers, applies to farm workers. What we look for.
Wait, so farm workers right now, some farm workers are making $5.15.
In addition to what Paul just spoke about, the Operation Blooming Onion, where we found that people that were actually supposed to be supporting, advocating for farm workers, protecting farm workers, were actually involved in human trafficking. Not only is that the responsibility and oversight from the labor commissioner, we expect more from our public officials. This is a constitutional officer that we're saying, where are you? Why aren't you working on behalf of all workers in the state? And we had an opportunity to update even our software, to look at our staff. He's reduced staff. Staff has been reduced over the last few years, not just during the pandemic, but prior to the pandemic. So we know during the pandemic, there were employees that left the department. We know that we have employees there that are just basically claims adjusters. They're not out in the field, they're not investigating. Paul also mentioned about the responsibility of job matching, because we don't want people to also have the impression that the labor commissioner is only there to cut checks for people that are suffering from unemployment. They're there to match people with jobs. If you lose a job, the best way to do that is to work with your workforce agencies and work source agencies to get those folks the training they need to go back and be viable members of the workforce. That's not happening here in Georgia.
Yeah, and I know, Paul, your face went kind of blank when I talked about the whole minimum wage part, the myth and the reality of it. You wanted to add something to that part of it?
Yeah, no, it really is, as Sandra said, a scandal that Georgia's minimum wage hasn't gone up in, I think it's close to 30 years and is at an irrelevant $5 and change an hour. But, by contrast, in neighboring Florida, the minimum wage is already $11 an hour and is going up to $15 soon. So in the Florida Panhandle, every worker will be guaranteed $15 an hour. But in Atlanta, there's no relevant minimum wage. And a pro-worker labor commissioner should be fighting, working with the legislature, fighting to give Georgia a real minimum wage, and to expand other basic protections. And there was a recent poll from Data for Progress, and it showed that close to 80% of voters support a $15 minimum wage, support paid family leave, and support employment protections for LGBTQ workers, and they want a labor commissioner to fight for all of those things. There's bipartisan support for them, and Georgians deserve a labor commissioner who will fight to deliver those sort of basic protections that workers in many, many other states have.
So the part that I thought was interesting is that we talk about so many times people just tie the Department of Labor into, as you mentioned, unemployment benefits, right? But they do more than that. They protect farm workers, and you talked about actually farm workers who were actually being mistreated.
Yes.
It was actually a case, and I heard about this, I think, last year sometime, where there were farm workers who were being raped on their farm, but they couldn't even report it because of the fact that they didn't have citizenship in order to be able to do so. So they were migrant workers. And that's another thing that we don't talk about, too, that the Labor Department is not designed to really be like an enforcer. They're not DHS, put it like that. They're really supposed to protect the rights of people who are working, regardless of whether or not.
Yes, you're correct. That's part of that blooming onion case that I talked about, or the operation that I talked about. Because if you have people that are being threatened with deportation, you are exploiting workers. In fact, when they came that they are coming as migrant workers, yet you threaten them and say that you'll have them deported to conditions that they know are horrendous in some cases, or their family could be harmed. These are all tactics that are being used through this Operation Bloomin' Onion, and that was part of the human trafficking that we should have known more about. If the people that were identified to do the jobs or not willing to do the jobs, we need to have a process whereby we can evaluate the work that's being done out in the field. So there are advocates, there are farm worker advocates that are out there that have uncovered a lot of this misjustice and have identified it. And now it's been identified. What are we going to do about it? What is the labor commissioner, what is the person, or what is that role going to do? The other thing I want to mention just briefly, because I think it ties very closely. Our state of Georgia always touts that we are the best state for businesses. We attract businesses here, and we have done a very good job of that. Just recently, there was a report that identified us as one of the top 3 worst states for workers, with North Carolina and Mississippi.
Oh, wow.
So those are the types of reports and type of information. When you look into them, when we have opportunities to help workers and we refuse to, when we have higher rates of denials, as Paul mentioned, for one segment of our population, we see that there are systemic issues here that are not being addressed. And that's why labor is intent upon working with NELP Action, with BlackPush, and with other organizations to identify and rectify this during this race.
So let me ask you a question. Oh, you was about to say something, Paul? I'm sorry.
No, please go on.
No, I was going to ask a question. So when we talk to people, who are voters, right, and I'm asking the question, why do I care about labor, right? I haven't been unemployed, don't really need unemployment benefits, but you guys have hit on some very valid points that it's the labor secretary or commissioner's job in the state of Georgia to protect your rights too. So to make sure that if you have a disability, that your disabilities are not being used against you versus being used for you. To make sure that if your job is supposed to be paying you and they're not cutting you short, they're not paying for 42 hours and giving you straight 42 hours when those 2 hours are supposed to be overtime. That's all part of the commissioner's job. Is that not correct?
Absolutely. The commissioner is supposed to ensure a just day's pay for every worker. And from labor's vantage point, you can imagine this is a right to work state. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean right to work for less or right to work at your discretion. What it means is that we are here as workers. We are productive members of society. If you decide that you don't like the color of my hair and you decide to eliminate me, not eliminate my position, but terminate me from employment, I need to have someone, I need to have the confidence that I can go to the labor commissioner, and I'm not talking about filing an EEOC case or any case of discrimination, but I need to know if that is not a good match for me, I have someone that I can go, or department head, which is the labor commissioner, to say, I need your help. There's a pattern going on here at this workplace. Or I don't want to go back to that workplace, but can you help me adjust, learn new skills, go to another job, another area? So that's why it's incumbent upon us. We know that the labor commissioner's role is very vital. Whether you've been unemployed in the past, like I said, the threat is always there in a right to work state.
Right.
That can change. You can be making $15 an hour today. We know that during the pandemic, there were a number of employers that elevated the wages of employees because they couldn't find adequate help. They couldn't find adequate help because we're seeing prices escalate, but if it costs you more to take care of your fuel costs, your daycare costs, your housing costs went up exponentially after the pandemic, your grocery costs, you have to pay people a living wage. You can't go in the hole, into a deficit, working. So they had to provide more. But we've had employers say openly that they're going to have to reduce the number of staff they have. So you're watching shortages occur. Wages may have gone up, but they reduced the workforce. So then what do those employees do? They rely on the services provided by the Labor Commission.
I mean, there's so much, Sandra is right, that in states with kind of pro-worker labor commissioners that agency can do to really help workers at every stage in their working career. And, Georgia needs a labor commissioner that'll do the same. And that's why it's so important. A lot of people, when they turn out to vote, they know about the top offices, but they may not vote down the ballot for these other positions like labor commissioner or attorney general or public service commissioner. And these are positions that actually really affect your day-to-day life. And it's really important to vote for them and to make sure you're evaluating the candidates and voting for someone who'll be a pro-worker labor commissioner, which is what the state badly needs.
All right, so when we talk about the Department of Labor again, too, one of the other big myths that we hear about a lot of times when we talk about the Department of Labor is that, like, the labor secretary doesn't impact my day-to-day life, right? And that's very much not true. So we kind of talked about it earlier today. In Georgia, we have a lot of issues. And I want to pinpoint, too, when we talk about Florida, let's make it clear that Florida didn't just, the governor and the legislator there didn't just decide to give Florida a minimum wage increase. It was actually a ballot initiative that was brought to the ballot by the constituents of the state of Florida, which, again, the reason why I want to point that out, Paul, is because in Florida, it's unconstitutional, and this is important that we point this part out, it's unconstitutional for a regular citizen to bring something to the ballot. So the only way we get representation when we talk about the minimum wage increase is we have to have somebody who's standing on our side to represent us. Is that not correct in the state of Georgia?
No, that's right. You don't have the ballot initiative process in Georgia like they have in Florida, where the voters have used that approach to raise the minimum wage a couple of times, and we've worked with them on that. So yeah, in Georgia, you really need your lawmakers really need to play that role, and that's why you need a labor commissioner who will fight for a relevant minimum wage in Georgia, which the state urgently needs.
Yeah, let me give you another example of something that Paul and I have worked on with reference or respect to the labor commissioner's race. We know that it is sometimes a very arduous task to get through the application process to fill out the unemployment application. And so here's what happens. If I find it to be a daunting task, I may not have internet, I may be semi-illiterate or illiterate, and or just not computer literate, it is not an intuitive system. We have been working to try to put in place what's called a navigator system. It's the law, it's a system that's in place in Maine, whereby organizations like BlackPush, like Labor, like NELP Action, any community organizations churches perhaps, could even help their members navigate that system, hence the term navigator system. Those are the types of progressive stances and approaches that we would like to see implemented by a labor commissioner because we want advocacy for workers in the state. But in the absence of that, I think in part, that some of the higher rates of denial for black workers and for brown workers in this state in particular may have been because they found it difficult to navigate that system and they simply gave up.
Right.
Yeah. And clearly the leadership has just not been interested in kind of common sense steps to improve their programs and make them more accessible. You know, there was actually more than $11 million of federal money earmarked for Georgia's Department of Labor to improve their programs that they declined to apply for, which was just, you know, this is money that Georgia taxpayers in part paid for with their federal taxes, and they didn't seek that money. And there's also there's a program that is actually generally very popular with business, this thing called partial unemployment or short-term compensation, which is a way to avoid layoffs when there are recessions. It allows companies, rather than to lay off workers, it allows them instead to kind of reduce a larger group of workers to part-time, but those workers can then get unemployment benefits to make up for their lost hours. And it's a very, you know, sort of a pro-business, pro-worker strategy, and the labor commissioner was authorized to implement it and it refused to do so. So they've really just been not been doing the kind of straightforward things, and you know that workers in the state need. And you know, thank goodness the current commissioner, Mark Butler, decided not to run again. So there's a real opportunity to elect someone who will have the interests of workers front and center.
So I want to pinpoint something that you pointed out just a minute ago. So for those who are upset with the Department of Labor here in the state of Georgia, saying that they're not answering my phone calls, the system sucks, and you're telling me that the state of Georgia had an option to tap into $11 million worth of money to improve their system, and the current commissioner elected not to.
That's correct. You know, it's really scandalous. Never heard a clear explanation of why, but it just makes zero sense.
And that's another thing, Sandra. I mean, you and I have worked with a lot of labor commissioners who are running for office, and now we know we have, I think, 2 primary candidates.
Yes.
There's 2 primary candidates, and we'll talk about them a little later. But one of the things that has been an instrumental part in this whole campaign is people talking about the Department of Labor system in the state of Georgia is really Flintstone. It's old, it's archaic, it's not effective at all. And even like I'll tell you, so even last year we had to do partial claims for a little while for our employees, and the state of Georgia did make an adjustment during COVID to allow for us to be able to file on behalf of our employees, sure. Right? But the problem is the crazy part is that when I hear that the Department of Labor is cutting back on staff, they're not cutting back that much, because I received a letter for every single one of my employees last year who got partial unemployment, and saying that they may have gotten overpaid like $20 or $30. Like literally, people are investigating $20 or $30. But yet we still have people out here who have not gotten the unemployment benefits. And so we know that there's not an issue as far as the Department of Labor not having money. It's just where we're using our resources at. But we do have an arcade system here in the state of Georgia.
We absolutely do. And the unwillingness to upgrade that system,
Thank you.
when in fact it was reported that a current commissioner spent over $100,000 over the pandemic for lunches for he and his staff.
That was not even in the office.
That is incomprehensible to me. When we talk about, and I spent many years in human resources, when we talk about partial unemployment, as Paul mentioned, as we're discussing here, I work with a number of folks that are in manufacturing. And so if a different line is put in or upgrades to the plant are implemented, sometimes that requires the plant or a certain particular section, for example, to be down for a while. So employees that may be off from work for 3 to 4 weeks can apply for partial unemployment because we know that they're coming back. They're not permanently laid off.
Right.
But the other part that I think we're missing in this conversation, if we don't address it now, is education. You can be a worker, but there was a time with previous administrations where I keep trying to pinpoint skills acquisition
Right.
and job matching. It doesn't mean because you're in a low wage, low skill, or unskilled job that you can't progress beyond that. And the labor commissioner's function, that whole department across the state, should be one to advocate how we can get people transition from low wage, unskilled jobs, because we know we have people that are coming back to the workplace. We know we have people that have been out of the workplace, raised a family, and now they're re-entering, and their skill set may not be what's required to get a higher wage job. Those are responsibilities and things that we look for when we talk about worker advocacy. That's what I would be looking for in a labor commissioner. There is no relationship between the educating our workers and our current administration in that labor commission's job, and that's what we want to see change.
And, you know, the other part, Paul, too, that is very interesting. So when we talk about labor, one of the things that is instrumental is we need to also pinpoint, we have to deal with two. So BlackPush, we know, does a lot of work with ex-offenders, right? Mm-hmm. So we have ex-offenders who are out there who are actually eligible to vote. So that's the first thing, but they cannot find a job. And the labor commissioner can play a part in that, can play a part in putting together programs that help ex-offenders actually get restored back into the community. But the other aspect of it is that we do have some ex-offenders out there who are not eligible to vote, and they can't get a job either, right? And the labor commissioner can do something when it comes down to that. We can create trade programs in the state of Georgia. We can actually work with our community colleges to put more CDL drivers on the streets. Like, we need more CDL drivers right now.
Well, here's the other very important aspect of that is we know that the labor commissioner and staff that are assigned to do this go out to make relationships with employers.
Right.
Identifying second chance employers would be key, particularly in a state that has high rates
the highest probation rate and the highest parole rate. The state of Georgia leads that, just for the record. Just for the record.
Right. So we need that resource. Right. We need that identification, and that is lacking. It's almost non-existent.
Yeah, these are more examples of very kind of common sense programs that the agency just isn't delivering on, and it's why we need new leadership there.
So I would say this too. So we have two candidates on the ballot that I'm aware of so far. I'm aware of William Bode, who's running on the Democratic side, and we have also, help me out,
Thompson, that worked for our current commissioner.
And they're running on the Republican side.
And he is running on the Republican side. And I have to say, one of the things, without talking, specifically about either candidates, we are tasked with looking at people that have advocated for workers in the past versus folks that have basically let it be a status quo, nothing has changed. We only intend to make advances in how we present our resources to workers. And again, I want to emphasize, we are all workers. You're either a retiree, you're going to be a future worker, if you're a student, there should be resources available. When I say resources, jobs training, skill acquisition is something that is key. Everyone does not go to college, and even if you do, there are opportunities that can be provided through the labor commissioner's resources because we have space across the state. Now, I also want to mention to you, in not opening the offices, we also had an opportunity to glean how much is paid for the rent and lease of those buildings.
That's interesting.
And who pays for that?
The taxpayer.
Absolutely. So the buildings across the state, millions of dollars have gone to buildings that sat empty for 2 years with no resources, no help for people. We actually had a rally last year, you may remember, in Augusta, where the staff, we were peacefully asking when will the doors be open, and they called the police on us. But we were certain that we were there in the right, and the police came and just asked us a few questions about why we were there. But it was, again, advocating for workers. We were peaceful, but the question is, if you're now in the building, if you have a few staff in the building, Folks can't get their phone calls answered. You won't open the door for them. Many times we've stood in front of closed, locked buildings where people showed up trying to get in to find out, can you please help me? I'm about to be homeless. I'm about to be evicted. Please help me. To no avail.
Paul, what did you want to add into that part of it?
Well, so one thing I just wanted to mention was that, for the next labor commissioner, we and the Atlanta North Georgia Labor Council and the Retail Workers Union and a large group of other partners, including New Georgia Project, published a report outlining, many of these common sense reforms that we've mentioned today on the podcast for how the next labor commissioner can make the programs more effective, advocate for updating Georgia's employment laws and really deliver the protections working Georgians need. You can find that report on our website, nelpaction.org. The other important thing I would add is there was a parallel poll from Data for Progress that showed that all of these proposals are overwhelmingly popular with Georgia voters. Supported in the 60-80% range. Most of them with strong bipartisan support from Republicans. So this is a kind of common sense agenda that really Georgia voters want and really should demand from their next labor commissioner.
And one of the things I found interesting is, like, I've been talking to a lot of people who work at the Labor Commissioner's office recently, right? And we give so much grief to them. It's kind of like this whole, I won't even bring them up, but we give so much grief to people who work at the Department of Labor. But we have to remember that they're just the employees, right? The person who oversees the Department of Labor is not the employees. It's the person who sits at the top, ultimately. And a lot of them, I've heard, right now, are not pleased with the current commissioner. And they want to see change. So in our last couple of minutes here, if you could say one more thing to voters out there today on why they need to get out, pay attention to the two candidates that we have who are currently running, look at their platforms, see what they stand for. And I will say this too, at the very end of this podcast, at the very end of this educational series, we're going to actually put the websites for both candidates up so people can go and look at their platforms, right? Okay. And see what it is that they stand for. But why is it so important that when I get out there, I don't just look at the labor commissioner spot and think that I can just choose anybody on the ballot? Why is it important that I pay attention, especially in 2022?
In 2022, we've seen enough changes post-pandemic to indicate that things are ever changing. While you may have been secure in your current role, there are so many people that are insecure in terms of housing, work, food insecurities are existing problems for us right now. We need a person that's going to advocate for workers. We need a person that's going to be empathetic to those people that need new skills as jobs are transitioning to more computerized, more system-oriented opportunities. So I would encourage anyone, look at people that advocate for your fellow man. Am I my brother's keeper? Yes, I am. We have to make hard choices about what our future will look like. And this is a key opportunity for us here in Georgia to do that.
And to make that happen, the kind of working Georgians need to vote this November, and they need to vote, to be sure to vote not just for senator and governor, although obviously those are important, but to vote down the ballot to all of these lower profile offices that have a profound impact on their lives, on the labor, the public service commissioner, which kind of determines, how high their electric bills are, and what the state does around transitioning to a green energy economy, and for the attorney general and the secretary of state, but especially for the labor commissioner, who most people again have never heard of and don't really appreciate that this is the office that really affects your day-to-day life in really, really basic ways. And especially when you're having trouble at work, this is an office that you need them to have your back, and Georgians deserve a pro-worker labor commissioner.
Yeah, I want to just agree with Paul in that comment. And as I said, as from the Retail Wholesale Department Store Union, we appreciate the opportunity to come here and speak.
Thank you guys both for coming on today, and thank you guys so much for giving your input today. And thank you for educating us on the importance of the labor commissioner race here in the state of Georgia.
Thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to be on with you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hey everyone, so thank you for a delightful conversation we just had with two great people. We had Paul Sonn on from NELP Action Fund, and we also had Sandra Lee Williams, who represents the Atlanta, North Georgia Labor Council as one of the board members, as well as the Retail Wholesale Department Store Union. Today we had a delective conversation about the labor commissioner race and the importance of the labor commissioner race. I need you guys to pay attention to this thing. We have to pay attention to who's running. We put the links for the two candidates that are running here in the state of Georgia. One is a Democrat, one is a Republican. But forget about Democrats and Republicans. You have to find the person who votes and who stands for your interests. Go to their website, learn about them, learn what it is that their platform stands for. And I need you to go and turn out on November 8th, but not even on November 8th. Let's get you rolling. Let's get you out early voting. Let's get you out early voting, and not only you, but everybody else. If you didn't think that the labor commissioner race was important, hopefully after this dialogue that we just had today, you've learned a lot about the labor commissioner race. And even if it doesn't impact you, I can guarantee you, your mom, your brother, your sister, somebody in your family has been impacted by the way that we do labor here in the state of Georgia. So you need to get out and vote. Even if it doesn't impact you, vote for somebody else that it impacts, right? So let's pay attention to this. Please stay attuned to our podcast, because not only are we talking about labor commissioner today, we're going to talk about every position in this state that people are running for, even down to our judicial branch. So stay tuned as we have our conversation, and please pay attention to what's going on here in the state of Georgia. Let's get out and vote.